It was a cold afternoon when Robert Turner, the millionaire businessman, found himself standing at the corner of a busy city street, his polished shoes tapping against the wet pavement as he waited for the light to change. He had a million things on his mind, meetings, contracts, and an important business deal that could make or break his future. But none of that mattered when he turned the corner and saw her. A young woman, no older than 25, sat on the cold concrete sidewalk. She had a baby in her arms, wrapped tightly in a faded blanket. Her eyes, though weary, held a quiet strength, and she looked up at Robert as he approached. The city around them bustled with hurried pedestrians, but in that instant, everything felt still. "Please, sir, could you help us?" Her voice was soft but filled with desperation. Robert, taken aback, stopped for a moment. He was used to seeing homeless people, but something about this woman struck him differently. Her clothes were ragged, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes, they were familiar. There was something about the way she looked at him, like she knew him. For a split second, Robert hesitated. He was a wealthy man, accustomed to offering charity through checks and donations, but something told him this moment required more than that. He knelt down beside her, his mind racing to understand what he was feeling. "How can I help you?" he asked, his voice much softer than he intended. The woman looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, she spoke again, her voice trembling. "I don't need your money," she said quietly. "I just need a chance. A place for my baby and me." Robert was thrown off guard. Most people in her situation begged for money, food, or a roof over their heads. But this woman, she wasn't asking for a handout. She was asking for something deeper, something that made Robert feel uncomfortable in ways he couldn't explain. As he looked into her eyes, something stirred within him. He thought he recognized her, but the memory didn't come easily. Was it from his childhood? Or perhaps someone from his past? He couldn't put his finger on it, but whatever it was, it made him feel uneasy. "I'll do what I can," Robert finally said, standing up. But as he turned to pull out his wallet, the woman stopped him. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You've already done more than you realize." Before Robert could ask what she meant, the light changed, and the rush of people moved around him. He glanced back at the woman and her child, but they had already disappeared into the crowd, as if they were never there at all. Confusion lingered in his mind as he continued down the street. Something didn't sit right. The encounter felt like more than just a random act of kindness, it felt like fate, a message he couldn't yet decode. The rest of his day passed in a blur, but he couldn't stop thinking about the woman and her child. The more he thought about her, the more a feeling of unease grew. Who was she? Why had she seemed so familiar? And why had she said those words, "You've already done more than you realize"? The truth would come crashing into his life in ways he couldn't have possibly imagined, but that day, on that cold city corner, was just the beginning. The answer to these questions would change everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. But for now, Robert Turner was left with a growing sense of curiosity, a mystery he could not yet solve. The truth, he was about to learn, was much closer than he thought. The days following that brief encounter with the woman were a blur for Robert Turner. His life, once dominated by meetings, conferences, and numbers, now seemed overshadowed by a single question: who was that woman? What had she meant by her cryptic words? Unable to shake the feeling of familiarity, Robert began to search for her. He drove through the city's busiest streets, scanning faces in crowds, hoping to catch a glimpse of her again. But every time he thought he saw her, it was someone else, a fleeting image, nothing more. He knew he had to do something, anything, to get closure. One evening, after another long day of unsuccessful searching, Robert stopped by a local shelter, hoping to find some answers. It wasn't a place he frequented, but something about it seemed right. When he walked through the door, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and old blankets. The sound of quiet conversations filled the room, but when the staff saw him enter, a hush fell. The woman was there. She was sitting in a corner, her baby asleep in her arms. The familiar, uneasy feeling crept over Robert again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked directly to her, his heart pounding. "You," Robert said, his voice soft but urgent. "I've been looking for you." She looked up slowly, her eyes not quite surprised, but guarded. Her face was pale, and the exhaustion was clear, but there was something else there now, a sadness, a quiet sorrow that hadn't been there before. "You're still looking for help?" Robert asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't know what else to say. The woman shook her head. "Help? I've been asking for help for years. People offer me money, food, but it's never what I need." She paused, her gaze drifting to her child. "What I need is a way out. A way for us to start over." Robert's heart ached as he listened. He could see it now, the desperation in her eyes, the weight of years of hardship. He had the power to help, to offer everything she needed. But he knew, deep down, that this wasn't about money. It was something deeper, something far more complex. "How can I help you?" Robert asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman looked at him for a long moment before answering, her eyes searching his face, as if weighing his sincerity. Then she spoke, her words slow, deliberate. "You can give me a chance," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions tugging at her. "You can give us both a chance to rebuild, to heal. But you have to understand that it won't be easy." Robert frowned, confused. "What do you mean? How can I give you a chance if you don't even know what you need?" She sighed, shifting the baby in her arms, then looked him in the eye. "You've already done more than you know." The words hit him hard, a wave of recognition rushing over him. What did she mean by that? How could he have already done something for her? The woman had said those same words before, on that street corner. They had haunted him since. Before he could ask anything more, the shelter's director approached, interrupting their conversation. The woman stood up, her face unreadable now. "I'm sorry," she said quietly to Robert, her voice laced with regret. "I can't stay here long. We move around a lot, and this place won't be safe for long." Robert wanted to stop her, to offer more help, but something in her eyes told him to let her go. She didn't need charity, she needed something more. But what? The director turned to Robert, his expression sympathetic but tired. "I understand your desire to help, Mr. Turner. But she's not just anyone. She has a past, a complicated one. I don't know if you're ready for it, but if you really want to help her, you need to understand that what she's carrying is heavy. It's a debt she can never repay." A chill ran down Robert's spine. A debt? What was the director talking about? Before Robert could ask for more details, the woman had already slipped out of the shelter, disappearing into the night with her baby. He was left standing there, more confused than ever. "She's hiding something," the director muttered. "And whatever it is, it's bigger than anything you could imagine." Robert was left alone with that thought, the tension mounting. What could be so big, so important, that it could bind a person to a past they couldn't escape? What debt was this woman carrying, and why was it tied to him? The mystery deepened, and Robert felt himself drawn into a web he couldn't untangle, yet. The following days were a blur for Robert Turner. The business deals he once could handle with ease now felt hollow, as his mind was consumed with thoughts of the woman and her child. The more he thought about her, the more questions arose. Who was she? What did she mean by the debt she could never repay? And how was it possible that he, a man who had spent his life burying his emotions beneath his wealth, felt so inexplicably connected to her? The encounter at the shelter had left Robert restless, unable to shake the haunting words the director had spoken. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The woman's mysterious past had to be unraveled, and he would not stop until he had the truth. Robert had always been a man of action, so it didn't take long for him to pull strings and gather information. After a few days of digging, he found a lead. A small record, an old address, and the name of a place that seemed to ring a bell. It was a location he hadn't thought about in years, a part of his past he had buried deep. He drove out to the address late one afternoon, the chill of the evening settling in as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house was small, unremarkable, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city. But it was the house of his past, the house of a woman he once knew, someone he had long forgotten. Standing in front of the door, Robert felt his heart race. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but part of him already knew. His hand shook as he knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness of the evening air. It took a moment for the door to open, but when it did, Robert's breath caught in his throat. The woman who answered was older now, her face lined with time and hardship, but there was no mistaking her eyes. They were the same eyes he had seen countless years ago, the same eyes that had haunted him in his dreams. She looked at him, recognizing him immediately. "Robert," she said, her voice soft but filled with a quiet sadness. "I didn't think you'd ever come back." He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had never expected to see her again. This was the woman from his past, the woman who had once been the love of his life. And now, standing before him, she was the key to understanding everything. "How? How did you know where to find me?" Robert asked, his voice strained. She smiled, but it was a sad smile, tinged with regret. "I've been waiting for you to come back. For all these years, I've waited." Robert stepped into the house, his heart heavy with the weight of old memories. He knew this conversation would change everything, but he hadn't prepared for how much it would hurt. "I don't understand," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you ever reach out? Why didn't you tell me what happened? I've spent years trying to move on, but you never gave me the chance to help." The woman's eyes welled with tears, and she reached out, touching his hand. "You couldn't help me, Robert. Not then. And not now. You see, I'm not the one who needs saving." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You didn't know," she continued, her voice faltering. "But the woman you saw on the street, the one you thought was homeless, is our daughter. She's yours, Robert. Our child. And I've been trying to protect her from the world, from the debt that follows us both." Robert's world shifted beneath his feet. His mind raced, unable to process what he was hearing. His thoughts were a jumble of disbelief and confusion, but the truth was undeniable. The woman standing before him wasn't just someone from his past. She was the mother of his child, and the child who had been in his arms all this time was his daughter. His head spun as the weight of her words sank in. The debt she spoke of, the debt that had kept her away all these years, was far greater than Robert could have imagined. The woman he had once loved had disappeared, not out of choice, but because of the consequences of his own past actions. And now, his daughter, the child he had never known, was the one paying the price. "What kind of debt?" Robert asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. The woman closed her eyes, taking a deep breath before answering. "The kind that doesn't go away, Robert. The kind that changes everything." For a moment, the world stood still. Robert's mind raced, trying to understand what this debt was, what it meant for his daughter, and what he could do to make things right. But there were no easy answers. He had been living in a world of luxury, never fully understanding the consequences of his actions. The mystery of the woman on the street, the mother and child who had seemed so familiar, was no longer a simple case of charity. It was a revelation, one that would forever change Robert Turner's life. And as he looked into the woman's eyes, he realized that the truth was just beginning to unravel. The silence in the room was deafening. Robert sat there, stunned, unable to form a coherent thought. His mind, usually so sharp and calculated, was now clouded with disbelief. His eyes never left the woman in front of him, the woman he had once loved, the mother of his child, the daughter he had never known existed. He had spent years of his life in a self-constructed bubble, pursuing wealth, success, and status. He had never once questioned the cost of his ambition, the impact it had on those around him. But now, in this small, dimly lit room, the truth was crashing over him like a tidal wave. The woman's words echoed in his mind, "She's yours, Robert. Our child. And I've been trying to protect her from the world, from the debt that follows us both." He stood up abruptly, pacing the room. How is this even possible? The question escaped his lips before he could think better of it. He had never imagined that his past, a past he thought he'd left behind, could come back to haunt him in such a way. The woman looked at him, her face a mix of sorrow and resignation. "It's the consequences of our choices, Robert. I didn't want to involve you, didn't want to drag you into this mess. But now, our daughter, she's the one suffering." Robert's heart sank as he tried to make sense of her words. "What do you mean, suffering? What kind of debt are we talking about?" His voice trembled with the weight of his confusion. The woman sighed deeply, her eyes clouded with regret. "It's not just a financial debt, Robert. It's a life debt. A mistake we made years ago, one that left me with nothing and her with everything to lose." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "You see, when we were together, we were both young and reckless. I thought we had forever, but you had other plans." Robert's chest tightened. He could hear the anger, the pain, in her voice, and it made him feel guilty for every moment he had ever taken his life for granted. He had always assumed that his wealth could shield him from consequences, but now, facing the wreckage of his past, he realized how wrong he had been. "Tell me everything," Robert said, his voice quieter now, filled with a quiet desperation. The woman nodded, her hands trembling as she spoke. "You remember the night we broke up, don't you?" Robert nodded. That night had been a blur of anger and misunderstanding. He had just started rising in his career, and he had been too focused on his own future to care about hers. They had argued, bitter words exchanged, and in the end, she had left. He never knew the full story, never understood the depth of her pain. "I left because I couldn't live in your shadow anymore," she continued. "But what you didn't know was that I was carrying our child, Robert. I couldn't keep the secret, but I didn't want to trap you with a responsibility you weren't ready for. So, I left, took our daughter, and started over. I thought I could protect her from everything." Robert's head spun. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of her words sank in. He had never known. He had never even imagined that the woman he had once loved had carried his child, raised her alone, and struggled in silence. The woman wiped away a tear, her voice cracking with emotion. "But I couldn't protect her, Robert. Not from the consequences of the past. There are people, powerful people, who want her, who have been watching her grow. They don't care about her safety or her future, they care about what she can give them." The room seemed to close in on Robert as he took in what she was saying. Who are these people? Why would they want her? The woman hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't know at first, but now I do. It's because of something she inherited, a gift she never asked for. And those people, Robert, they will stop at nothing to use her for their own gain." A chill ran down Robert's spine. What could his daughter possibly have that was so valuable? His mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but nothing made sense. "And what does this have to do with me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes met his, filled with a mix of sorrow and something else, regret, maybe. "It's because of you, Robert. Because of your blood. Your legacy. Your name. Robert's breath caught in his throat. His family's wealth, their influence, had always been a shield, but now it seemed like it was the very thing that had brought danger to the people he loved most. His daughter, the child he had never known existed, was caught in the middle of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. "Everything I've done, everything I've built, it's all led to this," he whispered, the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. The woman nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't want to bring you back into this. But now, it's too late. You have to help us, Robert. You have to protect her from what's coming." A storm was brewing, and Robert had no idea how to weather it. The truth he had uncovered had shattered his understanding of the world, and now, he had a responsibility, one he wasn't sure he was prepared to face. His life, the life he had built on wealth and ambition, had just collided with a past he could no longer ignore. And in the end, it was his daughter's future that would determine whether he could redeem himself, or lose everything once and for all. But for now, all Robert could do was listen to the woman's plea and try to piece together a plan, even though he knew that the answers he sought were far from simple. The truth had shattered everything, and Robert Turner was left with a choice: take action or watch it all slip away. Robert Turner barely slept that night. The weight of everything he had learned about his daughter, the debt that had followed her, and the looming threats hanging over her life consumed his every thought. He sat in the dark, the faint glow of the city lights outside his window offering no comfort. His mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of a world he thought he understood. The luxury, the power, the fame, everything he had built was now overshadowed by the undeniable truth that he had failed his family, failed his daughter without even knowing she existed. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, Robert stood up and walked to his desk. His reflection in the mirror caught his eye, but it was not the confident businessman he saw staring back. It was a man shaken to his core, a man who had spent so long hiding behind his success that he had missed the real price of his ambition. He looked down at the papers scattered across his desk, financial projections, business deals, investments that had made him millions. But the numbers no longer mattered. The meetings, the calls, the deals, they all felt meaningless in comparison to the one thing that now consumed him, the life of his daughter. His thoughts turned back to the woman, the mother of his child. She had suffered for years, raising their daughter alone while shielding her from the very forces that were now closing in. Robert knew, deep down, that the time for reflection was over. He had to act. But what could he do? He wasn't a man of action when it came to matters of the heart. His world had been built on calculations and contracts, not on understanding the deep, emotional complexities of family. And yet, as the reality of his daughter's life settled in, Robert felt a stirring within him, a need to do right, to protect the one person he had failed for so long. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the phone. It wasn't just a call for help, it was a plea for redemption. The people he would call now were not investors or business partners, they were people who could protect his family from the threats that loomed. But even as he dialed, a lingering fear gripped him. What if it was too late? What if the debts of the past had already come due? Robert's mind turned to the woman's warning: they will stop at nothing to use her for their own gain. He had to act fast. Time was running out, and he knew that whatever power and influence he had built over the years would be useless if he couldn't protect his daughter. Minutes later, he was in his car, heading to the shelter where he had first met the woman. It was a long shot, but he hoped to find some answers, perhaps a lead that could point him to the people who were after his daughter. The streets of the city looked the same as they always did, but to Robert, everything had changed. When he arrived at the shelter, he was greeted by the same weary faces, but there was no sign of the woman or her daughter. Robert's heart sank. Had they moved on again? Or worse, had they fallen into the wrong hands? He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He had to find them, and he had to find them now. A woman behind the front desk looked up as Robert approached. She recognized him instantly and offered a polite, if distant, greeting. "Mr. Turner, how can I help you today?" "I'm looking for someone," Robert said, his voice tight with urgency. "A woman and her child. She's been here before, maybe you remember her. She's about 25, with a baby." The woman behind the desk hesitated, her eyes flickering with something Robert couldn't quite place. "I remember her, yes. But she hasn't been here for a while. She left a few days ago, right after a man came looking for her." A chill ran down Robert's spine. "A man?" The woman nodded. "I don't know who he was. But he was different. He asked a lot of questions, and I didn't like the way he looked at her. I warned her, but she wouldn't listen. She said she had to keep moving for her daughter's sake." Robert clenched his fists, a surge of panic rising in his chest. "Did she say where she was going?" The woman shook her head. "No. She just told me to tell anyone who asked that she was fine and that she would keep going." Robert's mind raced. She was trying to protect her daughter from someone, from something. He had to find them, before it was too late. He left the shelter, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about a past he had left behind, it was about a future he now had to fight for. His daughter's life depended on it. As he drove through the streets, he began to make plans. He would reach out to his network, use whatever resources he had at his disposal. But the more he thought about the woman's warning, the more he realized how little he knew about the forces at play. Who were these people who were hunting his daughter? And why had he not seen it before? In the quiet of his car, Robert made a vow to himself. He would stop at nothing to find her, to protect her, and to make things right. The man he had been, the businessman obsessed with wealth and power, was gone. And in his place stood a father, determined to save his child from the darkness that was closing in. But the question remained, was it already too late? The truth had shattered everything Robert thought he knew about his life, but now he had one mission: to redeem himself and protect the future of the family he never knew he had. And that meant facing the consequences of his past head-on. The storm was coming, and Robert Turner was ready to face it. The days following Robert's realization were filled with a frantic urgency he had never known. Every meeting, every call, every interaction now felt like an obstacle in his way as he scrambled to piece together the scattered clues. The woman's words haunted him. "You have to protect her, Robert. You have to protect her from what's coming." He had no idea what "what's coming" meant, but he knew that he had to prepare. He reached out to the few contacts he trusted, hoping they could help him track down the woman and her daughter. He even hired a private investigator, someone he had worked with on business matters before. But the more he dug, the more Robert realized that there were no easy answers, no clear path forward. The people who had been watching his daughter weren't just criminals, they were organized, and they were dangerous. In the quiet hours of the night, when Robert couldn't sleep, he thought about the woman's warning, the debt that follows us both. What could she have meant by that? The more Robert thought about it, the more it felt like something he was supposed to remember, something buried deep in his past. But the memory wouldn't come. It was like a fog, a forgotten chapter that he couldn't quite reach. Frustrated, Robert walked the streets where he had first met the woman. He needed to understand her story, her connection to him. He needed to find out what had been hidden for so long. It was on one of these walks, as he turned a corner near the shelter, that he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. There, standing on the opposite side of the street, was a familiar figure, someone he had hoped never to see again. A man in a dark suit, with cold eyes and a sharp, calculating smile. It was Victor Darnell. Victor was a man from Robert's past, a man who had once been a business partner before their paths had diverged. He had always been ruthless, driven by a hunger for power and wealth that Robert had never quite shared. Robert had cut ties with him years ago, after discovering that Victor's methods were less than ethical. He had thought that Victor had disappeared from his life for good. But now, standing across from him, Victor was back. Robert's heart raced. He knew that the appearance of Victor was no coincidence. He had seen the same cold smile years ago, in the boardroom, when they had made their last deal together. That smile had always meant trouble, and Robert knew that if Victor was here, it could only mean one thing: his daughter was in more danger than he had ever imagined. Without hesitation, Robert crossed the street, making his way toward Victor. When they were face to face, Victor's smile widened, though there was no warmth in it. "Well, well," Victor said, his voice smooth, like oil sliding over stone. "I was wondering when you would show up." "What are you doing here, Victor?" Robert asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Victor took a step closer, his eyes glinting with amusement. "I should be the one asking you that, Robert. After all, you've been trying to dig into things that don't concern you. And now, look where it's brought you. You're not the only one with a past that comes calling, are you?" Robert clenched his fists, his mind racing. It was all starting to make sense now. Victor's return wasn't just a coincidence, it was tied to the woman, to his daughter, to the debt that had been haunting them both. "What do you know about her?" Robert demanded, his voice sharp. "About my daughter?" Victor's smile faltered, just for a moment. Then he recovered, his expression unreadable. "I know more than you think, Robert. And soon, you'll know everything." A sudden chill swept through Robert as he realized the truth: Victor wasn't just here to talk. He was here to control the narrative, to manipulate the situation in a way that would leave Robert powerless. Victor's gaze darkened. "You should have stayed out of this, Robert. But now that you're involved, there's no turning back." Robert's heart pounded. "What are you going to do?" Victor leaned in, his voice low and threatening. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." He paused, as if savoring the moment. "But you will be soon enough." With that, Victor turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before Robert could react. For the first time since learning the truth about his daughter, Robert felt truly powerless. He had thought he could protect her, but now it seemed like the forces against them were bigger, darker, and more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered. He stood there, frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Victor had always been a step ahead, but this time, Robert had to outsmart him. He had to protect his daughter, no matter the cost. But how? The clock was ticking. Time was running out, and Robert knew that if he didn't act fast, he would lose his daughter before he even had the chance to make things right. He had to find a way to get ahead of Victor, to uncover the truth behind the debt and the danger that loomed over his daughter. With renewed determination, Robert made a vow to himself: he would not let Victor win. He would not let the past consume his future. And most importantly, he would protect his daughter from whatever darkness was closing in. The battle was just beginning, and Robert Turner was ready to face it head-on. The days after his encounter with Victor were filled with an overwhelming sense of urgency. Robert's mind raced as he made plans to protect his daughter, to uncover the truth behind the dangerous forces that were closing in on her. The urgency felt like a constant weight on his chest, each hour that passed seemed to stretch longer than the last. He was no longer just a businessman focused on success. He was a father now, desperate to make things right, desperate to save the one person who mattered more than anything in his life. He had spent his entire life building an empire, but in these past few days, Robert had learned a painful lesson: none of that mattered if he couldn't protect his family. No amount of wealth, no network of influence, could shield him from the consequences of his past choices. But it was clear now, he couldn't run from those consequences. He had to face them, no matter how terrifying the truth might be. Robert's investigation into Victor's past, and his daughter's, had finally led him to an unexpected breakthrough. It wasn't just about the debt he had heard so much about. It wasn't some financial transaction or business deal that had caused the pain. The truth was far more personal, far more complicated than Robert had ever imagined. Through a mix of desperate calls and digging through old records, Robert uncovered a dark connection between his family and a group of powerful figures he had never known existed. The debt his daughter carried wasn't just a financial one, it was a legacy of betrayal and promises broken generations ago. The actions of his ancestors had set this entire tragedy in motion, and Robert's name, his wealth, his reputation, had all been tied to that debt in ways he could never have predicted. But as the pieces began to fall into place, Robert realized that it wasn't too late to change things. There was a chance to break the cycle, to end the generational suffering that had been passed down unknowingly. But only if he was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. With newfound resolve, Robert reached out to the woman and her daughter, tracking them down to a quiet, unassuming neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. As he stood in front of the door, his heart raced. He had no idea what to expect, no idea if they would even let him in. But this time, it didn't matter. The answers he sought, the redemption he needed, were on the other side. The door opened slowly, and there she was. The woman who had once been his love, the woman who had carried their child in secret, and the daughter he never knew he had. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything in Robert's life seemed to stand still. There was so much he needed to say, but the words felt inadequate. The woman stepped aside, and Robert walked into the small house, his gaze falling on the young girl in the corner, playing quietly with a set of toys. She was so much like him, and yet, in some ways, she was a stranger. He had missed so much of her life, years he could never get back. "I'm sorry," Robert said, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I should have been there. I should have known." The woman looked at him with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "You couldn't have known, Robert. I never wanted you to carry this burden. I thought I could protect her on my own." "But it's not just about protecting her, is it?" Robert replied, his voice firm. "It's about facing the truth. And now, we have to face it together." The woman nodded, and for the first time, Robert saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "You're right. It's time to face it. To end the cycle of pain that has haunted us both." Robert's heart swelled with a deep sense of purpose. He had always thought he could fix things with money, with power. But now, he realized that it wasn't about those things. It was about being there, truly being there, for the people who needed him. His daughter needed him, not as a wealthy businessman, not as a successful CEO, but as a father. Together, Robert and the woman came up with a plan to protect the child from the dark forces that had been chasing her for so long. They would no longer run. They would confront those responsible, face the people who had manipulated them, and free their daughter from the chains of the past. As the sun set that evening, Robert stood by the window, looking out over the quiet streets. He thought about the life he had lived, the choices he had made, and the man he had become. He knew that he could never undo the mistakes of the past, but he could shape the future. The lesson was clear: life wasn't about what you could accumulate. It wasn't about wealth, power, or status. It was about the people you loved, and the sacrifices you were willing to make for them. It was about redemption, and the chance to right the wrongs you had committed. And as Robert turned to look at the woman and the child, he knew that, no matter what came next, he had finally found the path he was meant to walk. He had found his true purpose, and it was standing before him. The storm was over. And in its place, Robert Turner had discovered the most important lesson of all: love, sacrifice, and redemption were the only things that truly mattered.